What credentials are needed to be a gospel minister? What credentials are needed to be a gospel preacher, a pastor? What credentials then did the early church use? What were Paul's credentials? And how do the credentials that we use today commonly in the church compare with the credentials that were used in the early church, that were seen by Paul? That's what we want to explore today as we continue in the study of 2 Corinthians and enter into the 3rd chapter. So, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? So, letters of recommendation. What do we see today? Do we see letters of recommendation? I, for a time, thought that we should replace the current system with letters of recommendation. That a Bible school, instead of offering degrees, should offer letters of recommendation. And perhaps at a time this was the common practice. The issue here is, how does this compare to the early church? And how does this compare to what Paul was teaching? You see, what we have gotten to today is that we expect a degree. Now, what does a degree measure? I ran into this very interestingly as I've traveled around the world. In the Free Will Baptists of mission work in North India, you must start by being what they call an evangelist. In these churches, you'd start as an evangelist. That meant that you were authorized to go door to door, trying to convert people. You knew enough to do that. And then you could become a deacon. And then, having proved each of these for several years, you could be considered for ministry. Others have different systems. But I saw in Africa, very interesting, that one group, the professors lived in a suburb of Nairobi called Karen. And very upscale, and had nothing to do with the students except in the classroom. And so this was the place to go if your character did not comport with your Christian profession. How should we do it? So I've seen all around the world different ways that this is viewed. However, what did Paul say? He said, first he apologized. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? What commendation is needed is what he's saying. But then Paul goes ahead and says, or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you? Or do we need letters of recommendation from you? Now that last is rather sly. He's saying, are you saying that you are such grand spiritual authorities that I, Paul, shouldn't go to other churches to preach, other cities to preach, without a letter saying, the church in Corinth approves of this man? Who do you think you are? He's kind of saying. You are not the church in Jerusalem, guys. Okay. But looking at the rest of it, do I need letters of recommendation to you? And he's going to go into, in the next verses, what are his qualifications? How can you know his qualifications? But he first says, do I need letters of recommendation? And I think it's a rhetorical question. No. Judge who he is. Judge who I am. I am not good in a classroom environment. One of the reasons for that, one of the reasons why I did not end up completing seminary, although I did attend there very briefly, is because I have a physical handicap that I was not aware of until a few years ago. That makes it almost impossible for me to complete the written, back in those days, written with the pen on paper, assignments. Is that a spiritual qualification? And one of the problems that I deal with in some of the other lessons in the James series concurrently, in the middle of chapter 2, is that the gospel has become somewhat twisted in the way it's preached because it is seen totally in an intellectual viewpoint. Well, why is it seen in an intellectual viewpoint? Because now all the leaders in the churches have to have a degree from an intellectual institution, a university. Quite a different thing from the early church, led by fishermen and leather workers. That's what Paul was, a tent maker, was a leather worker, actually. These are quite a different perspective. And so we need to consider, what are the real qualifications to call someone a man of God?